All right, AP World History students. So I regret to tell you guys that I've been diagnosed with COVID-19, and that means that I will not be with you for the remainder of this calendar year. I'll have to join up with us again in January. And while that's not ideal, I do want to say the good news is the hay is in the barn here for period two. We've done so much of the work that we already need to do. What's left is one last lesson. We haven't checked in with East Asia yet this unit, so we'll do our East Asia check-in. And then our review day, and I'm gonna just have to wait and see how I feel before we do the review day. But like I will tell you, the period two exam assignment has been posted to Google Classroom. All those the LEQ prompt bank is available. There's Kahoot challenges. There's a Quizlet study set. All the stuff you need to start grinding away for that exam is there. So you have what you need to begin the push for next Wednesday's exam. And and there's nothing magic about having me in the room. You guys are the magic. You guys are the one. My job is keep it organized for you. If I can keep it organized and straightforward, you guys are the ones that are tearing this thing apart like wild animals and devouring it. So just stay at it. Push through. We're going to get through this little weird glitch and then we'll be fine. So I'll tell you right now, I feel like I'm teaching through a heavy headache and my voice and my breathing feels just like shallow or weak. So I'm just going to push through as best I can here because I want to make sure you get this information, because actually East Asia is really key and it points forward to some of the dynamics we're going to be looking at in the period of time we're going to study starting in January when we get to 1750 to 1900. So anyway, lesson 210 is East Asia from 1450 to 1750. East Asia is old. It's like old friends. Hey, China, what have you guys been up to? And Japan, we learned about you a little bit before. Let's talk. And so we're kind of checking in and seeing what's going on. And I'd say the general theme is how are they responding to outside pressure? All right, so our learning targets, I can consider how East Asian powers responded to a newly emerging world order. What do they make of Europe's rising dominance? And I can predict how this is going to play out in world history. All right, so just jumping right in. In China, we're always talking about dynasties. So the dynasties between 1450 to 1750 are the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. So in the Ming Dynasty, the stuff to know about the Ming, I'd say we should associate Zheng He with the Ming Dynasty. It's always useful if you can, if you know like one big emperor from a dynasty. So the Emperor Yongle was the emperor who, Yongl, it looks like Yongle, which is a great sounding name, but the pronunciation is more like Yongle. And that's the emperor who sends out the Zheng He voyages. The aftermath of the Zheng He voyages, which is like... I note here, I said that's like they mismanage those and they mismanage the aftermath and lose a great opportunity. The Ming Dynasty is known for being let's call it like, not like unskilled, but kind of a conservative retrenchment after the Yuan dynasty. So there's the Mongols who come in and they shake things up, and the Ming are kind of like, all right, let's get back to how it ought to be or how it always has been before. And it's like a Confucian retrenchment, right? And the Zheng He voyages, and that aftermath really tells a story of Confucian retrenchment in the olds. That's not to say it was a mismanaged dynasty or something like that. It's quite a prosperous period for China still, and they are producing all kinds of trade goods that are still highly, highly sought after and desired, and China can still feel rightly, haughty or, enthusiastic about its role in the world economy. That's still all very true. The final dynasty, the final sort of imperial dynasty in China's history is the Qing Dynasty. And this one lasts a very long time. The Qing Dynasty would last into the 20th century, although it was really limping pretty badly by the end. Now, the Qing are sort of like the Yuan in a certain sense, in that the Qing Dynasty are not Han Chinese. All right, Han is like the main ethnic group. The Qing Dynasty are ethnically, they're Manchu people. So you can even see in this map here this area like where they are originally from, sort of northern China, the northern barbarians. Once again, it's northern barbarians coming in, and these sort of semi-nomadic people who take eventual control of China. Now, the Manchu or the Qing would have a somewhat different story than the Yuan dynasty. All right, so pardon me. They like the Yuan, they were outsiders. Like the Yuan, they were somewhat set apart. Unlike the Mongols, they embraced Confucianism. They established a long-lasting and, for the most part, well-run dynasty in China's history. One thing that was kind of similar to the Mongols is they just kind of set themselves apart. Like one very conspicuous thing in this image here, the students always remember this image, so it's worth keeping in. And if you remember, I want you to remember the image because it's just memorable. But I think if you connect it to something, connect it to the idea that the Qing dynasty wanted to establish or assert its dominance over the Han Chinese, right? And they wanted the Han Chinese to remember that it was the Manchu that had conquered them. And so they forced the Chinese men to have this hairstyle right here in the middle. I forgot what they call it. There's a name for this hairstyle. I can't remember it, but it's something else, right? Where you shave it back to the middle of your skull and you have this long ponytail, or sometimes pigtails in the back. This practice of the kowtow was also something that they insisted upon, where anyone approaching the Qing emperor had to keep literally touching or tapping their head to the ground repeatedly as they backed away. Some Chinese people saw the Qing as legitimate, as the legitimate rulers with the mandate of heaven, at least after 50, 60 years that happened. But there were some Chinese who just never, ever accepted the Qing as legitimate rulers of China. Whether they were accepted as legitimate or not, they expanded China, and they ruled China for all of the 18th and 19th centuries. All right, this was a dynasty that was in place for a long time. And the general pattern in the world that's going on during the time of the Qing is that Europe is ascendant. Right? So during the late 1600s, 1700s, and then by the 1800s for sure, the dominant power in the world is Europe, and China is sort of the sun is setting in China, so to speak, and it's rising in the West. And the Qing are kind of trying to accept this, negotiate it, manage it, and at a certain point they just get beaten over the head by it. And I'll teach you about that next semester. Throughout the whole Qing dynasty, there is still this Confucian stranglehold on the bureaucracy. There is still the old civil service examination system, and the fact that the Qing did last this long, even as Europe was on the rise, you give credit to just China's continuities and China's systems, right? Sometimes those continuities and systems can keep something going even after it has sort of rightfully seemed to kind of run out of gas on its own. But these systems are just so effective that they can kind of keep the thing running for a while. And that's kind of China. China in the Qing dynasty is a little bit running on fumes. On some level, you say, even that, though, is demonstration of how skilled the Chinese were at managing their own state. They had these systems that just kind of perpetuated themselves. But of course, by 1750, by the tail end of this period, China is going to have to reckon with the fact that it is just not the so-called Middle Kingdom anymore. And I'm really going to teach you that story in the next period of time, in period 3, 1750 to 1900. But just be advised that that's where the story's headed. When we're talking about East Asia here, and in particular focused on China and Japan, again, the thing that's changing here, the thing that's the disruptive factor is Europe. Europe is like the new neighbor. Hey, there's a new kid in town, or a new family moved in down the block. And that's initially Portugal. All right, the Portuguese were the first into the Indian Ocean. As we've learned, they are establishing these trade posts in the Indian Ocean and then in Southeast Asia, and then they're sniffing around into East Asia. The Portuguese eventually lose out to the Dutch, or more specifically the Dutch East India Company. And so there's Europeans arriving, and whether it's the Portuguese arriving in the 1500s or the Dutch showing up in the 1600s, or maybe the English showing up a little bit later on, it's not just it's not just the trade ships that come. It's not just the military presence or even like the private companies like the VOC. It's the missionaries, and that's also a disruptive factor. And so just sort of be advised that that's part of this process going on. Okay, let's skip across the sea and go over to Japan here. So in Japan, when we pick up our story, Japan is still in a feudal system. All right, Japan would hold on to its feudal system for quite a long time. And at the top of the feudal system, of course, is the position of the emperor. But as we've learned, please recall, the emperor in Japan is an interesting situation, right? There's just one dynasty, that's the Yamato dynasty, and they have sort of continual power. They hold the continual imperial throne throughout Japan's history, but they don't really have much formal political power. It's like a ceremonially important position. The emperor is someone who is deeply honored, but also just sort of like eyeball deep in ceremonial roles and customs, and they aren't actually administering a state. The role of administering a state at this point in Japan's history lies with the position called the shogun, or the shogun means the emperor's general. All right. So the shogun, in a sense, is like the man that the emperor has kind of given the keys of the state to and said, you operate the state. I'm going to be busy here representing Japan and being sort of a son of heaven and doing tea ceremonies, right? And that's going to take up most of my day. I got somewhere I got to be right now. Like you, the shogun, you administer the state. You wrangle the lords, the daimyo. You have your own army of samurai. You're doing all the business of state, basically. So sometimes we call this Shogunate Japan. The position of the shogun is that office is called the shogunate. And so in a weird way, and the shogunate is itself a hereditary position. So it's like a separate dynasty. There's the emperor's dynasty, and then there's the shogun's dynasty. And this position of shogun lasts itself, 700 years and 3 dynasties. So this is like its own like long-lasting institution. This will last into the 19th century. It'll last until the second half of the 1800s. Like all feudal systems, this whole system is based on like the exchange of land, or the exchange of military service, the exchange of agricultural service. We'll note a couple things in here. So the people you need to know, the shogun and the emperor, you certainly need to know the daimyos, or the landlords. The samurai we talked about before. That's like the warrior class of Japan. And then we have peasants, and below that, it's hard to see here, below peasants we have artisans and merchants, which is very Confucian, right? So we see a Confucian influence playing out there in Japan's class system. So let's talk about the shogunate system. The Tokugawa shogunate is the longest lasting dynasty of the shoguns, established by Tokugawa Ieyasu, pictured here. The thing that makes this dynasty interesting to us, and why we're going to pay attention to it in our class, is that this is the dynasty that is governing Japan during the time when Europeans begin to show up. Because that's really where the story is most interesting to us, right? Japan in and of itself doesn't really affect the rest of AP world history, but Japan being interfered with by European powers, okay, well, this is really a part of our story and a dynamic that we should pay attention to, because this is like the intersection of a bunch of themes in our course right now. So let's talk about this. The Portuguese are arriving in the 16th century, along with their missionaries. And when they show up, they tend to show up bringing as many cool trade goods as they can muster up. and they bring some military presence, and they bring their missionaries with them as well, and the Portuguese they basically look to establish a monopoly relationship. Like, hey, we want exclusive rights to trade here at this port and that port, and we want our missionaries to be here, and in exchange, we'll give you this much money, right? And the shoguns are sort of like, yeah, I don't know, sure, fine, okay, that's okay. And so for a while, the Portuguese are allowed to kind of operate here in Japan. And these Portuguese missionaries, I think they're Jesuits. I think they're Jesuit missionaries. They have a lot of luck converting many Japanese from Shintoism or Buddhism to Christianity, or Catholicism to be specific. And the number of Japanese Christians, hits 300,000 some by our best estimates. And so it's like, this is a change, right? This is a real change that's going on. And the Tokugawa shogunate becomes aware that this is a part of a pattern. This pattern had played out in the Philippines not many decades previous. And when finally the local Filipinos began to sort of push back against the Portuguese were so entrenched, and they had so many kind of Catholic converts or people who were sympathetic to the Portuguese for religious reasons within the Philippines now, that like they were helping the Portuguese. And so the Filipinos lost control of their own island chain to these people, the Portuguese. And so the Japanese, the shoguns, sort of makes this call of like, you know what, we're going to be done playing footsie with these guys. We had a deal with them and we were going to allow them to operate. But now they're getting a little big for their britches, and now some of this Christianity stuff is getting a little bigger than we want it to get, and so they decide to crack down. And the shoguns of Japan make this order to eliminate the southern barbarians. Now, southern barbarians they call them southern barbarians because Europeans tended to approach Japan from the south, because they're, again, coming from the Southeast Asia, if you can just imagine on a map, making their way up to Japan. So they tend to approach from a southern vector. And so this new order is given in 1639. Let's read from the shogunate. Hereafter, entry by the Portuguese galleons is forbidden. If they insist on coming to Japan, the ships must be destroyed, and anyone aboard those ships must be beheaded. And so they just say, we are cutting off the Portuguese. We've had enough of this deal. There is no more deal making going on. The Japanese, the Portuguese missionaries in Japan, there is brutal crackdowns on those guys. This is all depicted in a film and a book called Silence. Some of you might have read that with Mr. Walters. I'm not sure. And Japanese people who had converted to Christianity were tortured. The Japanese actually thought it was humorous or ironic. They crucified Japanese Christians. It was like, that's not something that had any connection to Japan previously, but the Japanese were like, you guys talk about this crucifixion thing, so here you go, here's some crucifixions. And they were crucified in the thousands, Japanese Christians were. So it's like it is a brutal crackdown. And again, if you're saying like, well, what's their problem with Christianity? That's a good question. I challenge you to consider that. What was the shogunate's problem with Christianity here? What did Christianity represent to them? Why were they? Was it the precepts of the religion itself, or was it something else? I hope you can see what the connections were. So Christianity is forced into, it still existed in Japan, although it was deeply, deeply underground. So the Tokugawa shogunate is moving in a direction of pretty rigid isolationism here. Now, stepping back a little bit. When the Dutch heard that the Japanese were looking to get rid of the Portuguese, the Dutch said, heard you got a Portuguese problem on your hand. Maybe we can help you with that a little bit. And the Dutch are keeping a respectful distance, but saying we could offer you some military goods, some cannon, to help you get rid of this pesky Portuguese rodent infestation you've got, right? And bear in mind, the Dutch are rivals of the Portuguese. The Dutch are trying to establish a trade post empire. They're trying to sort of dislodge the Portuguese from a key trading post of theirs. The Dutch are also Protestant rivals of the Catholic Portuguese, and so they're trying to, to them, the Portuguese losing is a win. Now, maybe the Dutch are saying, I don't know how close we could ever get with Japan, if Japan would ever let us in. I don't know, but if we can sort of separate the Portuguese from sort of one key place that they have access to in East Asia, then that's good for us. The shoguns accept some help from the Dutch, but also they are very, very wary. And a really interesting relationship begins between the Japanese and the Dutch, in which the Dutch were allowed to visit Dutch trade ships, the VOC, were allowed to visit Japan once a year. Just once a year. They can arrive. There's one place they're allowed to go to. It's a trade port. It's just a teeny tiny island outside of the city of Nagasaki. On this little island, traders had to stay on their ships or go on the little island, but they were not allowed onto the Japanese mainland. They were not allowed to interact with regular Japanese people aside from some officials that would come up and meet with them and some prostitutes that they brought up. Typically, a ship's captain or one ambassador from the Dutch was brought in annually to meet with the shogun, and he'd be carried in like a litter, this ambassador, and sort of covered up and not even allowed to sort of visit with local Japanese people, because the shogun wanted to hear basically the Dutch account of what was going on in the rest of the world, right? Because again, the shogun is saying, in order to maintain our control and not have happened to us what happened in the Philippines, we are sort of cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world. And so we allow this one peek in, and that's this once a year when the Dutch arrive. And there'd be a very, very, very limited bit of trade that would go on. But again, it was only allowed with the Dutch. So the Dutch would get a little bit of what they wanted. The Japanese got a little bit of what they wanted. And otherwise, the rest of the world was just told to stay away. And the Dutch could give their report about what was going on in the rest of the world. And otherwise, the Japanese banned all this outside technology and all this outside knowledge. They banned firearms because they said they banned firearms for a bunch of reasons. One, they are inherently destabilizing. That is true. Two, the samurai didn't like them because the samurai say you train for years and years with this sort of like elegant, artful samurai sword. A firearm, what is that? You can hand that to a peasant and say you point it here and you pull the trigger, and a peasant can suddenly kill a samurai. There's nothing honorable or good about that. That's not the way we should fight war. And so the samurai class is really pushing to sort of abolish or eliminate firearms. And the shoguns make the decision that they will eliminate firearms. Gunpowder weapons are eliminated from Japan. Can you believe that? There is some smuggled in book knowledge, especially like mathematics and medical knowledge. And those books that are smuggled in are referred to as rangaku, and that translates as Dutch studies. And what Dutch studies basically means is like scientific and humanistic knowledge of the world that the Japanese did not have, all right? It's like everything that the rest of the world was learning, but Japan as a sort of like, hermit kingdom in a certain way is sort of closing its eyes to during this period of time because the shogunate wants to preserve power. And so there was a deep, deep curiosity in Japan if you knew the right people to get your hands on these smuggled books, this Dutch studies. And it's just an interesting thing to just imagine what it would be like to just sort of have only these illicit glimpses at things like this medical anatomy book that Europeans were figuring out because the scientific revolution was underway there and no such thing had begun in Japan yet. So your assignment is just completing your assigned cell of the spices chart. But of course, beyond that, we're preparing for next week's exam. You can do this, guys. Thank you for hanging with me here today and bearing with my soft speaking voice that I'm stuck with at the moment. And I look forward to when I can be with you again. Email me if any questions pop up. Take care, guys. Bye.